you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of On the Line. Today, we're going to talk about role ambiguity. Now, this is more from a civilian perspective. We're going to have Connie Alleyne on shortly just to discuss what role ambiguity means, especially for civilian staff. And we're going to discuss how this could affect the facility, right? How this could affect operations, but more importantly, also employee morale. If you have bad employee morale, the job's not going to get done, guys. And we all know that. We want to do what we can to bridge the gap and build a good working relationship amongst everyone that works behind the wall. And we're looking at people that understand each other's perspective. Whatever that mission is, we still have to work together as one. And Connie, couldn't have someone better on the show than you to help me discuss this, because you actually gave me the term role ambiguity. It's not a term that I created. So before we define it, Connie, how are you today? And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Constantine Alleyne. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I'm also the podcast host for the Fly Behind the Wall and Conversations with Connie. I'm also a criminal justice professor at Monroe College, and I am also a contributor to Tier Talk. So I am enjoying my time working with Anthony.
We enjoy having you. The information that you provide is just spot on. And when I decided to do this episode for Guardian, obviously you're the person that's going to come online. I mean, you're the person that knows that area. Plus, again, with that Civilian Corrections Academy, I'm sure that this is a topic that's discussed a lot. Now, role ambiguity is something that you introduced to me a while back on the Tier Talk venue, and we wind up actually devoting a full episode on this. So I want to kind of take the bullets from that episode. But first, let's start off with what role ambiguity is and how does that relate to the civilian staff members?
For sure. So role ambiguity is when, people are pretty much uncertain or unclear about their expectations within a certain role. So particularly for civilian employees who may work for a vendor, so if I'm providing health services, but I don't work directly for DOC, my vendor may have expectations of me. But then when I come into the facility to provide my service, DOC has another set of expectations of me as a vendor or service provider. And really the big challenge here is that DOC, or in custody corrections, however you want to refer to it, we already know it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous in nature. And so for someone who comes off the street and they're not really sure how to operate or be effective in the environment, it can be very challenging. And when you have that space where you're just so uncertain, usually what we find is that people get very burnt out. They're anxious, they're uncertain, they're unable to really learn in the environment, and they become complacent. It's almost like, well, you know what, that's their job, not mine. And that's certainly not what we want, because it does create a significant security issue for us.
And obviously part of that role is defined by our interactions with the other departments. So there could even be a part where you could say custody could have that as well, especially if they're not working well with what needs to be done behind the wall, which means what needs to be done with the other departments. Because we really, for the most part, most of our mission is really collective. I mean, there is an effort for safety and security, but for what? For rehabilitation, to provide programming. So there's a level that we have to work together. And that interaction, to me, comes across in how policies are written. You could have some people at a higher level that may only write policies for the specific departments and not realizing how that policy may affect other departments. So you being on the administrative end, how do policies help break away from role ambiguity?
Well, policies are supposed to provide clarity. Policies are supposed to give you the direction that you need to go in and who you need to contact, who you need to involve, who do you need to engage. Policies are supposed to answer some of those questions and not leave it so much for you to try to figure it out. Unfortunately, sometimes there's a lot of trial by fire. But I think when we create policies, it's because we're trying to identify those gaps or those overlaps so that staff know what they should do in certain situations. Policies are like our plan. This is how we plan to make sure that there aren't those gaps and things aren't falling through the cracks.
Now, also, the understanding that we have for each other. I believe, and we discussed this before actually, that when we're trying to build the gap between civilians and custody. Now, what I mean by this, guys, is that there is a divide, guys, sometimes between programming side of things and safety and security. And the reason why the conflict exists sometimes is because maybe there's limited resources and there's a push for programming. So a lot of the resources go to programming, and staff, custody staff may just be overwhelmed, and maybe they have to do things that they feel violates safety and security just to get programs done, and they feel that they're secondary to programming. So even though what they don't realize is that it is a joint mission, I wish the agency would advertise that more, that it's not programming comes first and safety and security comes second, that there is a joint mission. But yes, the foundation is always going to be safety and security, right? You can't have programming without some level of safety and security, because no one's learning in an environment that's just not conducive to that. But with that said, there should be a level of understanding between the civilians and custody, which I know what to expect from you, you know what to expect from me, and then we go ahead and we work out this beautiful dance. It's a beautiful dance, but it really does start at the very beginning, Connie, and we talked about this on prior episodes, but I really do think that if we want to do this right, you got to have the different representatives from the civilian side, the different departments, go to those academies and start talking to those officers, because I have a feeling this, and tell me if you agree. If custody starts seeing the importance of programming, of what's needed just to kind of get the job done. But again, when I say important, I mean us working together, because we need each other. And then also there's a greater voice behind that, but that's for another dialogue. Once they start seeing how well this can work if we're working together, and how we're not working in this in an isolated fashion, we will start discovering each other's role. We'll start discovering so I mean, do you believe right now maybe part of the discussion that needs to be had is understanding of what we're meant to do from all levels, which starts right at the entry level positions?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's always important that we have some cross-functional team engagement. That way we do have an understanding that we're learning from each other, because as we know, currently with higher levels of role ambiguity, you find these very high levels of conflict. And the challenge with that is that we stop communicating with each other, which is always going to break down any situation we have going on. We also stop building trusting relationships with each other, which creates more of a divide. And so the more that we can focus on building those relationships and really collaborating with each other, the better it is for the industry.
Yes, and I can tell you right now, you definitely see that at a management level. When you're at that front line, it's tough to see, but when you start moving up, you really start looking at all the moving parts, and you're always worried when those moving parts start to connect. Like sometimes I'm already good with the departmental side. Okay, I know this is going to work, but then it's when that department has to, relate to another department. It's like, okay, we're going to have some conflict here. And that's when you have to bring people to the table and really discuss, what needs to be done that benefits all departments. Because if it wasn't for administration, you wouldn't have the balance, because everybody's just going to be on that departmental survival mode. But also, when you talked about morale, a lot of civilians think that when they come into corrections, they're not accepted by custody, and therefore they don't feel that they're part of the team. And being part of a team is also about who you are, that role behind the wall. So how important is that feeling of we're part of something for the civilians to have that feeling?
So absolutely. So being a part of the team works in many, many ways positively, right? So if you feel like you're part of the team, you're going to join, you're going to have that buy-in to the rules, right? You're going to want to build that kind of relationship with custody because we're part of the team. But I think the challenge that we find is that when civilians don't feel like they're part of the team, when issues arise, it becomes your problem. It's not our problem. And that's not what we need. It becomes a situation where I might have seen something, but I didn't say anything because that has nothing to do with me. I have nothing to do with safety and security. My voice is not a trusted source. And so I think that's when civilians start to kind of clam up and they get very myopic with the approach. It is, this is my job, this is what I'm here to do, and everything else is someone else's job. And that's certainly not safe for any of us. But I do think there's some good news with role ambiguity, because I think it forces us to have some tough conversations. It brings us to the table because some conflict has been sparked. Now we have to talk about it. It kind of opens the door for us to be a little bit more innovative. And it's challenging because even though we want to be innovative, we're driven by these administrative directives, the policies, the procedures that have been so ingrained in the system that it's kind of hard to move the needle. But when you can provide enough justification and together we're working to make this work, I think that's when we tell a different story and we find that innovation is actually possible behind the wall.
You're hitting on something great, because management will definitely see the connections and how it benefits, the agency itself or the facility itself, because that's their job. They oversee it all and they want the parts to connect. And again, I like what you said about, touching on that employee morale and, having an understanding of what our roles are, but more importantly, how our roles are with each other. The interaction is really the key here. So what is it that, because this is actually a good question that I would love to actually get the answer to this, because this is something that actually we go through every day, but I know management sees it, but sometimes management has trouble explaining that to the front line. Sometimes the front line may not see the importance of the different departments working together on any level. I mean, yeah, there's the bigger scope, we know that, but sometimes even if it's on just a smaller level of just maybe something that, let's talk about program for a second, something that maybe custody could do to reinforce what's being taught in the classrooms. How would you go ahead and approach frontline to let them understand that there is an importance for us to connect, that it's not just something from management perspective to see that there's benefits for you here when it comes to working together with the other departments?
So it comes a point where we have to leave our egos at the door, right? Like, here it is, we've been assigned a mission, the mission, if it's rehabilitation, if it's programming, and be able to learn from someone else, right? So the transparency and the communication as to why it's important needs to happen. So if it's a matter of us just saying, hey, listen, the more offenders we get out, the higher these recidivism rates are, like, it just makes us look like we're not doing our jobs behind the wall. Maybe someone needs to just hear that, right? Maybe they need to know that it's not about us sort of treating them inhumanely. Maybe we need the training. Let's sit with mental health. Let's sit with medical. Let's sit with programming. Let's sit with reentry. Let's understand why the programs are important and how we can work together to make it happen. As opposed to, I mean, I've talked to many inmates that were like, I was on my way out the door and the officer said, oh, I see you on Monday. Right? I mean, yeah, you might have come back. It may not have been Monday, but the messaging, I think, can sometimes impact what that looks like when you go outside. But if we've got a collective message that, we are about rehabilitation, we are trying to help them succeed once they get out, because it works for us. It makes us better, I think, as a group, if we are now being transparent about why this is important. If it is about the numbers, is it about the stats? Do we need to make sure our recidivism rates go down? Is it about the budget, right? Is it too costly for us to have such a high amount of inmates behind the wall? And how do we manage that? Is it programs? Is it treatment? And we need to all be on board to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think obviously the key here is definitely for management to highlight the importance of us working together and not stay focused on isolated goals. Like, hey, rehabilitation numbers are down to this, and then you're not doing nothing about maybe how many lives were saved by custody or how many, codes were stopped or, because again, in order for us to have programming, custody scrambling there, they're doing what they can to provide an environment that's safe. So, people have to realize that programs exist because custody is doing their job and maintaining an environment that's conducive to that. Now, in closing, Connie, I just wanted to touch on one thing before we sign off, but this is really about bridging the gap. This dialogue here is really about connecting the two worlds, the program side with the custody side, because again, if we work together, guys, I mean, not only are we talking about the missions of the agency, but a tremendous voice that we can carry over and help deal with concerns that are on a national level, because I think you have, 700,000 people that work in prison, something like that. I think that's the number. So I mean,
Yes.
that's a hell of a voice for this great profession. So I think dialogue like this, understanding each other's role, because it's not even about understanding your own role, but I think part of it is, do I understand what you have to do so you yourself can understand what you have to do? Because there's that interaction. We're not doing this by ourselves here. So I think this is a great way to have that dialogue, to promote some level of understanding and just ultimately build that bridge. Connie, and like you always mentioned before, that bridge is paramount for our survival. If we're divided, inmates they win. I mean, that's what it is. They simply win. Connie, you have anything you'd like to say in closing, Connie Alleyne?
In closing, I would just like to say clarity is key, right? Like, we have to take responsibility for when things are ambiguous and when we have not provided the appropriate or the clear direction to the staff. Whether it's civilian, whether it's custody, there's a clear direction that we're heading into. And I think we have to be certain about that direction and be able to articulate that clearly to our staff. And until we're able to do that effectively, we're probably going to always be kind of plagued with this particular challenge.
And guys, this dialogue has to happen because this is the evolution of correction. This is where we're at. Got to embrace it. You can't be resistant to it, because if we're resistant to it, then we're the ones that get left behind on either on either side. You know, and we don't want that. We want to grow together, and we want to accomplish things together, because in the end, as I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again, this isn't a job that you can do on your own. This is a job that's very dependent on the many departments, and the faster we get to appreciate each other, I think actually the faster we get to a working environment that's more healthy, a working environment that we look forward to going to every day, as opposed to just, oh man, I just came to work on a Monday. I'm in my first minute. I have 39 hours and 59 minutes left to complete this week. So, hey, it happens. As always, guys, the show is On the Line. Don't forget, subscribe. New episode every Friday. Stay safe.